Hi everybody, and in this video I want to talk about strength of correlation. Strength of correlation describes how strong a trend is in data. And when we examine it, what we want to do is we want to look at the pattern that we see between two variables. So let's just take a look at positive correlation first. Okay, so we'll look at examples of positive correlation. Examples of positive correlation. And why don't we try and we'll draw three graphs, and I'll explain to you how we can look at those graphs and decide on the strength of the correlation. So first of all, let's draw one like this. Draw an XY axis. Okay, and for this one, why don't we use an example kind of like we were before. What we'll do is we'll put in hours of study as our independent variable, as our x-axis variable, and we will put in test mark as our dependent variable. And so we're going to say that your test mark is your dependent variable. And remember that whenever we graph relationships, our dependent variable goes on the y-axis. That's an important thing to remember. Dependent variable always goes on y-axis. Okay. And how do you know which one's dependent? Well, you just make a statement to yourself. You say, does it make sense to say that my test mark depends upon the hours of study? Or does it make sense to say that the hours that I study depends on my test mark? I think if you take a moment to reflect and think about the two statements, it makes a lot more sense to say that your test mark depends upon the hours that you studied. Okay, so that means because your test mark depends, your test mark goes on the y-axis. So we just want to keep that in mind as we make our variables, okay? And then, just looking at the graph, hours of study could go from like 0, okay? And then maybe somebody studied up to 10 hours. Test mark, same thing, you could go from 0 to maybe 30 hours of studying. My fault. You could get 100% on the test if everything went really well, right? 100. Okay, so anyway, imagine that we surveyed a class of a bunch of people and we saw a relationship between each person and their test mark, and we saw something like this. And a couple of dots got in there accidentally. What would you say if you saw a result like that? Well, you would notice that the points are very close together, okay? So, and also, if we were going to put a circle around the all of the dots, the circle would be it would be like an oval, right? It would be very close together. Might be something like that. I'll do that again. Hang on. I'll do that again in a different, go like this, and we'll go. Okay. That would be an example of strong correlation. That's an example of strong correlation. Okay. So strong correlation. In strong correlation, the dots, and we'll call it actually strong positive correlation. Strong positive correlation, the dots are grouped tightly together in an oval, we'll call it a thin oval pattern. Okay, so that's an example of strong positive correlation. Okay, well, what about weak, or, well, okay, so let's take something in between. Why don't we take somewhat strong or medium strong, okay? The word they actually use for that is moderate. I'll write that down in a second. But they call that medium correlation. So imagine that we took our data points and we looked at them and they were like that. Well, I hope you can see that it's still positive, but the oval pattern is a little wider now. Okay, so I'll draw it again, the oval pattern. Maybe we can get a full. Okay, so that's like medium strong correlation. We'll call that medium strong correlation. And the word they use for that oftentimes is, this is medium strong, which they call moderate. Okay, positive correlation. And in that case, it's still an oval, but the oval is wider than before. Okay, so it's still an oval, but the oval is wider than before. Now, why don't we go ahead and look at an example of weak positive correlation? So let's go ahead and look at that, just so we have a good picture of that, okay? So I'll take my dots out here and I'm going to erase this dot here. And yeah, now I would still say that this pattern is positive, but it's not. And maybe I'll just, to make it up, maybe I'll just erase this one too. Okay, so it's like, maybe I'll erase this one and bring it out a little. So I'm just trying to kind of give you an idea of like what weak looks like. So maybe like that. Okay, so there we go. Now look. Okay, so weak positive correlation comma, the dots are scattered further apart and are closer to being a circle, right? All right, so that's what we see when we have weak positive correlation. All right, so these are our forms of positive correlation that you want to be thinking about. And in the next video, I'll take you through negative correlation. And I think you'll find that that's very much the same. But still, good chance to review it, and hopefully you find it helpful.